The following is a radio address by Joseph Stalin to the people of the Soviet Union on July 3rd, 1941, following the invasion of the Soviet Union by Hitler in June of that year. Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, men of our Army and Navy, my words are addressed to you, dear friends. The perfidious military attack by Hitlerite Germany on our fatherland began on June 22nd, is continuing. In spite of the heroic resistance of the Red Army, and although the enemy's finest divisions and finest Air Force units have already been smashed and have met their doom on the field of battle, the enemy continues to push forward, hurling fresh forces to that front. Hitler's troops have succeeded in capturing Lithuania, a considerable part of Latvia, the western part of Belarusia, and part of western Ukraine. The fascist aircraft are extending the range of their operations, bombing Murmansk, Orsha, Mogilev, Smolensk, Kiev, Odessa, Sevastopol. Grave danger overhangs our country. How could it have happened that our glorious Red Army surrendered a number of our cities and districts to the fascist armies? Is it really true that the German fascist troops are invincible, as the braggart fascist propagandists are ceaselessly blaring forth? Of course not. History shows that there are no invincible armies, and never have been. Napoleon's army was considered invincible, but it was beaten successfully by the armies of Russia, England, and Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm's German army, in the period of the First Imperialist War, was also considered invincible, but it was beaten several times by Russian and Anglo-French troops, and was finally smashed by the Anglo-French forces. The same must be said of Hitler's German fascist army of today. This army has not yet met with any serious resistance on the continent of Europe. Only on our territory has it met with serious resistance, and if, as a result of this resistance, the finest divisions of Hitler's German fascist army have been defeated by our Red Army, this means that it too can be smashed and will be smashed, as were the armies of Napoleon and Wilhelm. As to part of our territory having nevertheless been seized by the German fascist troops, this is chiefly due to the fact that the war of fascist Germany against the USSR began under conditions that were favorable for the German forces and unfavorable for the Soviet forces. The fact of the matter is that the troops of Germany, a country at war, were already fully mobilized, and the 170 divisions brought up to the Soviet frontiers and hurled by Germany against the USSR were in a state of complete readiness, only awaiting the signal to move into action, whereas the Soviet troops had still to effect mobilization and move up to the frontiers. Of no little importance in this respect was the fact that fascist Germany suddenly and treacherously violated the Non-Aggression Pact which she had concluded in 1939 with the USSR, regardless of the circumstance that she would be regarded as the aggressor by the whole world. Naturally, our peace-loving country, not wishing to take the initiative in breaking the pact, could not resort to perfidy. It may be asked, how could the Soviet government have consented to conclude a non-aggression pact with such a perfidious people, such fiends as Hitler and Ribbentrop? Was this not an error on the part of the Soviet government? Of course not. Non-aggression pacts are pacts of peace between two states. It was such a pact that Germany proposed to us in 1939. Could the Soviet government have declined such a proposal? I think that not a single peace-loving state could decline a peace treaty with a neighboring state, even though the latter were headed by such monsters and cannibals as Hitler and Ribbentrop. But that, of course, only on the one indispensable condition that this peace treaty did not jeopardize, either directly or indirectly, the territorial integrity, independence, and honor of the peace-loving state. As is well known, the Non-Aggression Pact between Germany and the USSR was precisely such a pact. What did we gain by concluding the non-aggression pact with Germany? We secured our country peace for a year and a half, and the opportunity of preparing our forces to repulse fascist Germany should she risk an attack on our country despite the pact. This was a definite advantage for us and a disadvantage for fascist Germany. What has fascist Germany gained, and what has she lost by perfidiously tearing up the pact and attacking the USSR? She has gained a certain advantageous position for her troops for a short period of time, but she has lost politically by exposing herself in the eyes of the entire world as a bloodthirsty aggressor. There can be no doubt that this short-lived military gain for Germany is only an episode, while the tremendous political gain of the USSR is a weighty and lasting factor which is bound to form the basis for the development of outstanding military successes of the Red Army in the war with fascist Germany. That is why the whole of our valiant Red Army, the whole of our valiant Navy, all the falcons of our Air Force, all the peoples of our country, all the finest men and women of Europe, America, and Asia, and finally, all the finest men and women of Germany denounce the treacherous acts of the German fascists, sympathize with the Soviet government, approve of its conduct, and see that ours is a just cause, that the enemy will be defeated, and that we are bound to win. In consequence of this war, which has been forced upon us, our country has come to death grips with its bitterest and most cunning enemy, German fascism. Our troops are fighting heroically against an enemy armed to the teeth with tanks and aircraft. Overcoming numerous difficulties, the Red Army and Navy are self-sacrificingly fighting for every inch of Soviet soil. The main forces of the Red Army are coming into action equipped with thousands of tanks and planes. The soldiers of the Red Army are displaying unexampled valor. Our resistance to the enemy is growing in strength and power. Side by side with the Red Army, the entire Soviet people is rising in defense of our native land. What is required to put an end to the danger imperiling our country, and what measures must be taken to smash the enemy? Above all, it is essential that our people, the Soviet people, should appreciate the full immensity of the danger which threatens our country and gives up all complacency, casualness, and the mentality of peaceful constructive work which was so natural before the war, but which is fatal today, when war has radically changed the whole situation. The enemy is cruel and implacable. He is out to seize our lands watered by the sweat of our brows, to seize our grain and oil secured by the labor of our hands. He is out to restore the rule of the landlords, to restore Tsarism, to destroy the national culture and national existence as states of the Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Uzbeks, Tatars, Moldavians, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanians, and the other free peoples of the Soviet Union, to Germanize them, to turn them into slaves of German princes and barons. Thus, the issue is one of life and death for the Soviet state, of life and death for the peoples of the USSR. The issue is whether the peoples of the Soviet Union shall be free or fall into slavery. The Soviet people must realize this and abandon all complacency. They must mobilize themselves and reorganize all their work on a new, wartime footing, where there can be no mercy to the enemy. Further, there must be no room in our ranks for whimperers and cowards, for panic-mongers and deserters. Our people must know no fear in the fight, and must selflessly join our patriotic war of liberation against the fascist enslavers. Lenin, the great founder of our state, used to say that the chief virtues of the Soviet men and women must be courage, valor, fearlessness in struggle, readiness to fight together with the people against the enemies of our country. These splendid virtues of the Bolshevik must become the virtues of millions and millions of the Red Army, of the Red Navy, of all the peoples of the Soviet Union. All our work must be immediately reorganized on a war footing. Everything must be subordinated to the interests of the front and the task of organizing the destruction of the enemy. The peoples of the Soviet Union now see that German fascism is untamable in its savage fury and hatred of our native country, which has ensured all its working people labor in freedom and prosperity. The peoples of the Soviet Union must rise against the enemy and defend their rights and their land. The Red Army, Red Navy, and all citizens of the Soviet Union must defend every inch of Soviet soil, must fight to the last drop of blood for our towns and villages, must display the daring initiative and mental alertness which are inherent in our people. We must organize all-around assistance to the Red Army, ensure powerful reinforcements for its ranks, and the supply of everything it requires. All our industries must be got to work with greater intensity to produce more rifles, machine guns, cartridges, shells, planes. We must organize the guarding of factories, power stations, telephonic and telegraphic communications, and arrange effective air raid protection in all localities. We must exterminate spies, sabotage agents, and enemy parachutists, rendering rapid aid in all this to our extermination battalions. We must bear in mind that the enemy is crafty, unscrupulous, experienced in deception and the dissemination of false rumors. We must reckon with all this and not fall victims to stratagem. All who by their panic-mongering and cowardice hinder the work of defense, no matter who they may be, must be immediately hailed before a military tribunal. In case of a forced retreat of Red Army units, all rolling stock must be evacuated. The enemy must not be left a single engine, a single railway car, not a single pound of grain or gallon of fuel. The collective farmer must drive off all their cattle and turn over their grain to the safekeeping of the state authorities for transportation to the rear. In areas occupied by the enemy, guerrilla units, mounted and on foot, must be formed. Sabotage groups must be organized to combat enemy units, to foment guerrilla warfare everywhere, blow up bridges and roads, damage telephone and telegraph lines, set fire to forests, stores, and transports. In occupied regions, conditions must be made unbearable for the enemy and all his accomplices. They must be hounded and annihilated at every step, and all their measures frustrated. The war with fascist Germany cannot be considered an ordinary war. It is not only a war between two armies, it is also a great war of the entire Soviet people against the German fascist armies. The aim of this national patriotic war in defense of our country against the fascist oppressors is not only to eliminate the danger hanging over our country, but also to aid all European peoples groaning under the yoke of German fascism. In this war of liberation, we shall not be alone. In this great war, we shall have true allies in the peoples of Europe and America, including the German people, which is enslaved by the Hitlerite misrulers. Our war for the freedom of our country will merge with the struggle of the peoples of Europe and America for their independence, for democratic liberties. It will be a united front of the peoples standing for freedom and against enslavement and threats of enslavement by Hitler's fascist armies. In this connection, the historic utterance of the British Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill, regarding aid to the Soviet Union and the declaration of the United States government signifying readiness to render aid to our country, which can only evoke a feeling of gratitude in the hearts of the peoples of the Soviet Union, are fully comprehensible and symptomatic. Comrades, our forces are numberless. The overweening enemy will soon learn this to his cost. Side by side with the Red Army, many thousands of workers, collective farmers, and intellectuals are rising to fight the enemy aggressor. The masses of our people will rise up in their millions. The working people of Moscow and Leningrad have already begun to form huge People's Guards in support of the Red Army. Such People's Guards must be raised in every city which is in danger of enemy invasion. All the working people must be roused to defend with their lives their freedom, their honor, and their country in this patriotic war against German fascism. In order to ensure the rapid mobilization of all the forces of the peoples of the USSR and to repulse the enemy who has treacherously attacked our country, a State Committee of Defense has been formed, and the entire state authority has now been vested in it. The State Committee of Defense has entered on the performance of its functions and calls upon all our people to rally around the party of Lenin and Stalin and around the Soviet government, so as to render self-sacrificing support to the Red Army and Red Navy to exterminate the enemy and secure victory. All our forces for the support of our heroic Red Army and our glorious Red Navy. All the forces of the people for the destruction of the enemy. Forward to victory.
Welcome to Prolespod.
Welcome back to Prolespod. This is Tony. In this episode, we continue the Stalin Eras series with the Part 4 narrative, titled Enemy at the Gates, which focuses on the pivotal years of 1939 to 1942. In it, we cover the invasion of Poland, the fallout of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Soviet expansion into the Baltics, the death of one Leon Trotsky, and the long-expected invasion of the USSR by Nazi Germany. The Stalin Eras is the most in-depth podcast series on the life and times of Joseph Stalin. If you've somehow stumbled on this episode without listening from the beginning, we highly recommend you begin with episode 63, The Stalin Eras, an introduction, 1878 to 1917. Before we get to the narrative, first a huge thank you from the Prolespod team to all of our listeners for supporting the show as we've worked hard on this series. Your constructive feedback, likes, shares, subscriptions, encouragement, and all the ideas have helped really fuel this project. And an additional special thanks to our listeners who have supported us on Patreon at patreon.com/Prolespod. I recommend you check our Patreon out. It is no exaggeration to say that there is no Stalin Era series without your continued support. Enjoy the episode.
Father of four. Amidst his overwhelming party and state responsibilities, it's easy to forget that Stalin was also a father of four, with a family life as complicated as anyone's, if not more so, given his position in Soviet society. By 1939, Stalin's eldest son, Yakov, the child of his first wife, was in his early 30s. Stalin's relationship with Yakov had always been strained, likely due to Stalin's absence during Yakov's childhood, a consequence of his life as a career revolutionary. Yakov's mother died of typhus shortly after his birth, months after the infamous Tiflis bank robbery. As a result, Yakov was raised by his maternal grandparents in Georgia. It wasn't until 1921, at the age of 14, that Yakov moved to Moscow to live with Stalin. This transition was undoubtedly difficult for Yakov, who didn't speak Russian and who found himself thrust into an entirely new world and family dynamic. The tension between father and son was further highlighted when Yakov attempted suicide after Stalin expressed disapproval of his choice of a bride. This incident underscores the fraught nature of their relationship. Stalin was notably harshest on Yakov among his children, though the reason for this remained unclear. Despite this, Yakov went on to graduate from the Institute of Transport in 1935 and worked for years as a chimney sweep engineer at an electric plant, ironically named after his father. In 1937, he entered the Artillery Academy and became an officer in the Red Army. Stalin's next eldest son was Artyom Fedorovich Sergeyev, whom Stalin adopted after the death of Artyom's father, a close comrade during the Civil War. Artyom was roughly the same age as Stalin's biological son, Vasily, the child of Stalin's second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva. Reflecting on his upbringing, Artyom recalled this conversation with Stalin. Once he asked Vasily and me what we wanted to be when we grew up. Vasily said we would become officers and go to capitalist countries to help the proletariat break free from the bourgeoisie. Stalin replied, "Are you sure you will be welcome? First, make life attractive here in the USSR so that the world appreciates how we live. Then, perhaps you will be asked for help. But you will surely have to fight for our motherland. We have many enemies." Artyom described the atmosphere of Stalin's modest dacha as hardworking. He believed that being part of Stalin's family came with no privileges. It was not in any way a privilege to be close to Stalin's family. We all knew there would be war soon, and Stalin wanted us to prepare to defend our country. Most of the children of CP leaders either joined the army or went to work in the defense industry. Artyom's disciplined nature stood in stark contrast to Vasily's, who was a notorious troublemaker. Vasily's lack of control and poor attitude frustrated Stalin, who often ranted about his son's bad grades and behavior. Vasily and Svetlana attended Moscow's prestigious School No. 25, which embodied socialist values under the guidance of its dedicated administration and teachers. The school granted no special privileges to the children of public figures or Soviet celebrities, treating all students equally, regardless of their social background. The student body included children of janitors, peasants, doctors, and marshals of the Red Army. Despite his father's prominence, Vasily received no leniency for his poor behavior, which included skipping chemistry and geography classes, forgetting his notebooks, and refusing to participate in lessons. In short, Vasily was a malcontent. When Stalin was away, both Vasily and Svetlana wrote to him about their activities. Svetlana detailed her academic achievements, while Vasily boasted about his success in soccer and volleyball. Svetlana, Stalin's youngest child and only daughter, recalled, "His time for seeing me and Vasily was during dinner at the apartment. He'd ask me about my lessons, look at the daybook where my marks were entered, and sometimes ask me to show him my exercise books. He used to sign the book containing my remarks, as parents were supposed to do, right up to the war, and he signed Vasily's until he went off to special aviation school in 1939. Svetlana, as noted in previous accounts, was the apple of Stalin's eye. The two shared a close relationship, and she was often held up as an example for her brothers to follow. To Stalin, she could do no wrong. The immense responsibilities Stalin held in his political career made it impossible for him to be a consistently present father. As a result, his children were largely raised by a combination of family members and hired caretakers. Despite the strained relationships, particularly with his biological sons, Stalin remained a concerned and invested parent, even if his involvement was often from a distance.
The fall of the Second Polish Republic. In the early hours of September 1st, 1939, 60 German divisions, comprising 1.5 million soldiers, launched a full-scale invasion of Poland. The day before the invasion, the Nazi SS orchestrated a series of deceptive false flag operations. Disguised as Polish soldiers, they attacked the Gleiwitz radio station and other German border facilities. These staged incidents, combined with years of relentless propaganda promoting Aryan supremacy, the concept of Lebensraum, living space, to justify German expansion, and exaggerated claims of mistreatment against Poland's German minority, were all carefully crafted to provide a pretext for the invasion. However, beneath these fabricated justifications lay the true driving force behind the Nazi aggression, an insatiable appetite for capitalist expansion. From its inception, the Nazi regime was bolstered by the support of major corporations and banking institutions, all eager to exploit the untapped markets, abundant resources, and cheap labor of Eastern Europe and beyond. This alliance between fascism and capital was the cornerstone of Nazi power. The Second Polish Republic, established after World War I, was ill-prepared to withstand the Nazi onslaught. Employing their revolutionary blitzkrieg strategy, a lightning-fast offensive combining air power, tanks, and infantry, the Germans overwhelmed Polish defenses. In just over 2 weeks, the Polish government was forced to flee, first to Romania, and then to France, where it established a fragile government in exile, which would limp along throughout the war. Within 48 hours of the invasion, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany, honoring their defense treaties with Poland. While this moment is often cited as the start of World War II in Western historical narratives, it is important to recognize that conflict had already been raging for years elsewhere. From the Soviet Far East to the battlefields of Asia and the Spanish Civil War in Europe's own backyard, the seeds of global war had long been sown. Yet it is this specific moment, the invasion of Poland, which Western historians traditionally mark as the beginning of the deadliest conflict in human history. The invasion of Poland may have caught the Western powers off guard, but it came as no surprise to the Soviets. In fact, the likelihood of such an invasion had been explicitly discussed during the negotiations over the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which had been signed just a week earlier. The secret protocol attached to the Non-Aggression Pact outlined a clear understanding between the two powers.
In the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of the areas belonging to the Polish state, the spheres of influence of Germany and the USSR shall be bounded approximately by the line of the rivers Narew, Vistula, and San.
As the German blitzkrieg tore through Poland, Stalin met with Georgy Dimitrov, a prominent leader of the Comintern. During their discussion, Stalin reflected on the new opportunities emerging from what he described as the political realignment unfolding across Europe. His remarks hinted at the strategic possibilities the shifting geopolitical landscape presented for the Soviet Union. A war is on between two groups of capitalist countries for the redivision of the world, for the domination of the world. We see nothing wrong in their having a good hard fight and weakening each other. It would be fine if, at the hands of Germany, the position of the richest capitalist countries, especially England, were shaken. Hitler, without understanding it or desiring it,
is shaking and undermining the capitalist system. We can maneuver, pit one side against the other to set them fighting with each other as fiercely as possible. The Non-Aggression Pact is, to a certain degree, helping Germany. Next time, we'll urge on the other side. Formerly, the Polish state was a national state. Therefore, revolutionaries defended it against the partition and enslavement. Now, Poland is a fascist state, oppressing the Ukrainians, Belarusians, and so forth. The annihilation of that state under the current conditions would mean one fewer bourgeois fascist state to contend with. What would be the harm if, as a result of the rout of Poland, we were to extend the socialist system into new territories and populations? Following the initial stages of the Nazi invasion, German communications actively encouraged Soviet intervention. However, the USSR bided its time, waiting for what it deemed the most opportune moment to act. That moment arrived just 2 weeks later, on September 17th, 1939, the day after the conclusion of the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, when the Red Army advanced into Poland. The Soviets justified their intervention by citing the oppression of Ukrainians and Belarusians under Polish rule. This pretext was not unfounded. Soviet newspapers accurately reported widespread enthusiasm among Ukrainians, Belarusians, and other national minorities, including Jews, who welcomed the Red Army's advance from the east. The Soviet leadership harbored deep resentment toward the now exiled Polish government, a sentiment rooted in part in the territorial losses Lenin and the Bolsheviks had suffered to the newly formed Polish state in 1921. This animosity was evident in Molotov's scathing remarks, where he barely concealed his disdain. No one could believe that the Polish state would display such feebleness and rapid disintegration. The ruling circles of Poland made a lot of noise about the solidity of their state and the might of their army. However, a brief blow against Poland, initially by the German army and then the Red Army, proved enough for nothing to remain of this misshapen offspring of the Versailles Treaty, living at the expense of suppressed, non-Polish nationalities. The traditional policy of unprincipled maneuvering between the playing off of Germany and the USSR turned out to be a failure and was completely bankrupt. The situation grew awkward when Nazi forces advanced beyond the agreed boundary line with the Soviets. Was this a deliberate provocation, a game of chicken, or an attempt to hasten Soviet intervention? Whatever the motive, the Nazis ultimately retreated with minimal conflict, marking the first retreat of German forces in World War II as Soviet troops advanced into Poland. A critical detail often omitted in bourgeois accounts of the Soviet entry into Poland is that the Soviets only occupied territories which had been part of the former Tsarist Empire and the nascent Soviet Union before being lost a mere 18 years earlier. From a historical perspective, one which extends beyond the memory of a goldfish, the Soviet advance was less about territorial expansion for its own sake and more about reclaiming lands which had once been theirs. Another common misconception is the conflation of the Nazi invasion with the Soviet advance 2 weeks later. While modern European commemorations often portray the Soviet intervention as a bloodthirsty quest for expansion, this was not the prevailing view at the time. For instance, Winston Churchill, then a British politician and future Prime Minister, offered a more nuanced perspective in a famous radio broadcast on October 1st, 1939. He argued, "Russia has pursued a cold policy of self-interest. We could have wished that the Russian armies should be standing on their present line as the friends and allies of Poland instead of as invaders. But that the Russian armies should stand on this line was clearly necessary for the safety of Russia against the Nazi menace. I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But perhaps there is a key. That key is Russian national interest. It cannot be in accordance with the interest of the safety of Russia that Germany should plant itself upon the shores of the Black Sea, or that it should overrun the Balkan states and subjugate the Slavonic people of southeastern Europe. That would be contrary to the historic life interests of Russia." The Polish government in exile never declared war on the Soviet Union, nor did France or the United Kingdom, both of which had declared war on Nazi Germany following its invasion of Poland. This raises an intriguing semantic question. Whether the Soviet Union's actions can truly be described as an invasion of Poland. By the time the Red Army advanced, the Polish state had effectively ceased to exist as a legitimate or functional entity. Adding to the complexity, General Edward Ridge-Smigli, the Inspector General of the Polish Armed Forces, explicitly ordered Polish troops not to engage Soviet forces as they moved in. While both the Nazis and the Soviets harbored grievances against the now-defunct Polish state, their intentions for the occupied territories could not have been more different. The Germans, who controlled roughly 50% of former Polish territory, viewed the Polish people as racially inferior, fit only for manual labor, and incapable of developing what they deemed a real culture. This perspective was part of the broader Nazi blueprint known as Generalplan Ost, or General Plan for the East, which aimed to displace non-Germanic Poles and replace them with German settlers in their newly conquered territories. Hans Frank, a German lawyer and high-ranking Nazi official, was appointed Governor General of the Nazi-occupied zone in Poland. Under his rule, most administrative roles above the local level were handed over to German officials. The non-German population in these territories faced forced resettlement, Germanization, economic exploitation, and a gradual process of extermination. Frank infamously declared, "The Poles are to be the slaves of the greater German world empire." One of the first decrees issued by the Nazi administration was the closure of all universities and secondary schools for Polish inhabitants. Poles were barred from most parks and cafes, while the best train cars and streetcar seats were reserved exclusively for Germans. In essence, Poles were relegated to a status akin to that of black people under Jim Crow laws in the American South. A fact which is unsurprising, given that Nazi legislators explicitly studied and drew inspiration from American racial segregation laws when crafting their own racist policies. The situation in the Soviet-occupied zone was markedly different, especially for minority groups. Churchill was not alone in his measured acceptance of the Red Army's advance. Many of the national minorities who had faced oppression under Polish rule, particularly Jewish communities, welcomed the Soviets with open arms. One poignant recollection comes from Holocaust survivor Maxwell Smart. "When the Soviet army arrived, flooding the streets of Buchsaks, they began dancing in the streets, singing and playing music on their harmonicas and accordions and having a wonderful time. They were dancing with the local girls and were very friendly. My father related well to the Soviets, and when the Soviet government opened a cooperative for clothing and footwear, he became its director and the manager of this division. These were very difficult times for my family, but I experienced no anti-Semitism in the schools because the Soviets would not allow it. To the Soviets, everyone was equal, and many younger people became impressed with the ideals of communism. While we were under Soviet occupation, we felt safe. I was never called a dirty Jew as I had been before. Contrary to what my father and mother expected, the Soviets were very congenial, particularly to the school children. The Soviet occupation was detrimental to the economy, but for the Jewish children, it was a wonderful time. Better than under Polish rule. Schools were reopened, and the teachers were friendly and helpful. I became the teacher's pet because of my drawings and because I was a good student. I learned to speak Russian very quickly. The children in the Soviet Union were required to attend school. We enjoyed our classes and we played a lot of sports. There was a building with a beautiful lawn with trees and flowers not too far from my school. I did not know who lived there before the Soviets came, but I now learned that it was the residence of the bishop. The Soviets removed the bishop and converted the building into an orphanage, and the orphan children were taken off the streets in Buxaks and the small towns around us. The Soviet government dressed them neatly and cleanly, and the orphans proved to be model children and dedicated students. I was friendly with some of those orphans, and we studied together for the 2 years that the Soviets occupied Buxaks. Much has been written about Soviet repressions against Poles following their advance into eastern Poland. The majority of these repressions targeted military officers, priests, members of the bourgeoisie and their families, most of whom were part of the Polish majority. This approach mirrored policies implemented across the USSR during the 1920s. Those targeted were often sent to gulags or deported to remote areas of the Soviet Union to build new settlements. As was often the case, the disruptions caused by collectivization and nationalization alienated many potential allies. Through a hurried but necessary process of Soviet-style elections, essential given the absence of a functioning Polish government, the newly occupied territories were formally absorbed into the Soviet Union. Under the 1936 Soviet Constitution, the inhabitants of these regions became Soviet citizens. Ironically, one of the most concise summaries of the Sovietization of Poland from 1939 to 1941 comes from a CIA report published near the end of the war. Through the medium principally of the All-Union Communist Party, the Soviet government had, between 1939 and 1941, thoroughly Sovietized that portion of Poland occupied by the Red Army. After confiscating and nationalizing the land and distributing it to the poorer peasants, and nationalizing practically all other means of production and distribution, the party authorities gradually inaugurated the collectivization of the peasant economy, a process which by the time of the German invasion had made substantial progress. With the dispossessing, execution, or deportation of the landlords, factory owners, and managers of a large portion of the middle and professional classes, and some of the wealthier peasants, a leveling process set in. Under the director of the Communist Party, obviously designed to eliminate every trace of Polish rule and of the bourgeois social structure in this area. By the time of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Eastern Poland could hardly be distinguished in most essential aspects from other predominantly agrarian regions of the Soviet Union. While the Soviets extended citizenship to the people in their newly acquired territories, the Nazis treated theirs as slaves, a stark contrast in ideology and practice. Given the genocidal intent of the Nazis toward the Polish population, how could Stalin and Soviet leadership have rationalized the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and its accompanying agreements? From Stalin's perspective, the liberal democratic nation-states of the West, built on foundations of genocide, slavery, and colonialism, existed on the same continuum as the openly fascist, unabashedly capitalist Nazi state. Only through an anti-colonial lens could the Soviet Union's willingness to engage with such powers be understood. Anti-colonial thinker Aimé Césaire, along with many colonized peoples of the time, recognized that the atrocities Hitler would later become infamous for had already been committed on a far larger scale by Western powers. Césaire famously observed that what horrified Europeans most about Hitler was not his crimes themselves, but rather the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the blacks of Africa. Despite their pledges of support, Britain and France did little to intervene as the Polish Republic was dismantled, ushering in what became known as the Phony War. While Poland was being occupied, British troops moved to France, but took no further action. Stalin, observing this inaction, likely concluded that he had made the right decision in signing the Non-Aggression Pact. If Britain and France were unwilling to come to Poland's aid, would they have intervened if the USSR were invaded? To Stalin, the answer would have been glaringly obvious.
The Soviets returned to the Baltics and a new party line. Just 1 week into the Nazi invasion of Poland, the Communist International, or the Comintern, now thoroughly purged, issued a directive to communist parties worldwide. This message outlined a new party line, reflecting the shifting material conditions brought about by the unfolding conflict. The Comintern's statement marked a dramatic pivot in strategy, urging communist movements to adapt to the rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. The present war is an imperialist war, an unjust war, with respect to which the bourgeoisie of all the belligerent states are equally culpable. In no country must the working class, nor even less the Communist Party, support the war. The bourgeoisie is not waging war against fascism. As Chamberlain and the party leaders of social democracy maintain, the war is turning out to be between two groups of capitalist countries for the domination of the world. The international working class can in no way defend fascist Poland, which has refused help from the Soviet Union and oppresses the other nationalities. The communist parties have fought against the supporters of Munich because they preferred a genuine anti-fascist front with the participation of the Soviet Union, but the bourgeoisie of England and France have repulsed the Soviet Union in order to conduct a predatory war. The war has changed the situation fundamentally. The division of states into fascist and democratic has now lost its former significance. Accordingly, tactics must change. The tactic of communist parties in all belligerent countries at this stage of the war is to come out against the war, to expose its imperialist character. Where there are communist deputies present, they must vote against war credits, explaining to the masses that the war will bring them only trouble and ruin. The governments which declare their countries neutral, but seek to profit, support the war by other countries, like the government of the United States, in Japan and China, must be exposed. Communist parties must, above all, launch a decisive offensive against the treacherous policy of social democracy. Communist parties, in particular the French, the English, the Belgian, and the US parties that have hitherto acted contrary to these views must immediately correct their political line. This sudden shift in policy sent shockwaves through communist organizations worldwide, many of which had dedicated nearly a decade to a collective anti-fascist strategy under the banner of the Popular Front. The abrupt reversal fostered widespread disillusionment among party members and fellow travelers, prompting many to abandon their support for communism in favor of other radical movements. This sense of betrayal was further compounded by the recent conclusion of the Moscow trials, in which defendants were credibly accused of conspiring with Nazi Germany. Now they were an ally of some sort? For those who steadfastly upheld this new line, how did they justify such a dramatic pivot? First, they argued that the defendants in the Moscow trials were guilty of attempting to undermine Soviet sovereignty, territorial integrity, and governance with the support of foreign military intervention. The Soviet government engaging the Nazi regime diplomatically through official channels for mutually beneficial agreements was simply not comparable. Second, they pointed to the stark material realities that had emerged from the Spanish Civil War, the ongoing conflict across Asia, and the repeated rejection of collective security agreements by Britain and France. These developments had rendered the idealistic, anti-fascist alliances of the past untenable, forcing the Soviet Union to adopt a more pragmatic approach. Third, they believed that the new policy would safeguard the socialist motherland, at least temporarily, buying precious time to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with fascism. This strategic breathing space, they contended, was essential for the survival of the Soviet experiment. Finally, their unwavering support was rooted in a deep trust in Stalin and the Soviet leadership, who had earned their loyalty as stewards of an imperfect yet hopeful socialist project. Despite its flaws, the Soviet Union represented a beacon of progress and resistance against global capitalism and fascism, and its leaders were seen as the best hope for its continued survival. The movement away from communist organizing in the fallout of the Non-Aggression Pact was further exacerbated by anti-communists' dubious accusations that communist supporters were now aligned with Hitler. Ultimately, the uncomplicated narrative of anti-fascist struggle that had fueled a global communist resurgence in the early 1930s now led to widespread disillusionment, particularly amongst intellectuals. The perceived betrayal of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact and the deepening of economic ties between these ideological enemies were seized upon by critics of the USSR to portray the Soviet Union as Nazis by another name, twin totalitarian regimes. Conveniently, these critics ignored the prior and future entanglements of Western powers with fascist regimes, which have never garnered the same condemnation. Leon Trotsky, the chief anti-communist communist, devoted significant effort to promoting this narrative, writing extensively to equate Stalin's USSR with Hitler's Germany, writing, "The German-Soviet Pact is a capitulation of Stalin before fascist imperialism with the end of preserving the Soviet oligarchy." Radicalized Marxists, disillusioned by the Nazi-Soviet Pact, often turned to the alternative offered by Trotsky's Fourth International, which positioned itself as a staunch advocate of anti-capitalism, anti-fascism, and, most importantly, anti-Stalinism. However, by the 21st century, the legacy of the Fourth International had become one of negligible political influence, infiltration by Western intelligence agencies, and a frustrating history of endless internal divisions. The new economic relationship between the USSR and Nazi Germany was significant. The German-Soviet Economic Agreement, signed in February 1940, alongside other accords, established the foundation for economic cooperation between the two nations. Regarding these agreements, Stalin remarked, "Soviet foreign policy has always been based on belief in the possibility of cooperation between Germany and the Soviet Union. When the Bolsheviks came to power, they were accused of being paid German agents. It was the Bolsheviks who concluded the Rapallo Agreement. It provided the basis for the expansion and deepening of mutual relations. When the National Socialists came to power in Germany, relations worsened, as the German government deemed it necessary to give priority to internal political considerations, After a while, this issue exhausted itself, and the German government displayed the will to improve relations with the Soviet Union. Historically, the Soviet government never excluded the possibility of good relations with Germany. Hence, it is with a clear conscience that the Soviet government begins the revival of collaboration with Germany. This collaboration represents a power that all other combinations must give way to. Stalin, again, viewed liberal, democratic, and fascist states not as fundamentally distinct political systems, but as existing on a shared capitalist continuum. To him, they were different expressions of the same underlying economic order. Under the economic agreements signed in August 1939, February 1940, and January 1941, the Soviet-German trade surged dramatically. Exports and imports between the two nations increased tenfold, reaching levels not seen since the early 1930s. The Germans extended credits to the Soviets, enabling them to purchase machinery and manufactured goods, while the Soviets supplied Germany with essential raw materials. This mutually beneficial arrangement deepened economic ties between the two powers, despite their ideological differences. Between January 1940 and June 1941, the following raw materials were supplied by the Soviet Union to Germany: 1.5 million tons of grain, 100,000 tons of cotton, 2 million tons of petroleum products, 1.5 million tons of timber, 140,000 tons of manganese, 26,000 tons of chromium. Among the most critical Soviet exports to Germany were essential materials to the German war economy, which had been severely constrained by the British naval blockade. In exchange, the Soviets received machine tools, finished metals, chemical products, and military equipment, among other goods. In terms of value, the trade was remarkably balanced, with imports and exports each totaling approximately 500 million marks. This trading relationship persisted right up until the eve of the German invasion in 1941. The economic partnership between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany from 1939 to 1941 was a pragmatic arrangement, providing short-term benefits to both sides despite their ideological antagonism. Unsurprisingly, all of Stalin's foreign policy moves beginning in 1940 were aimed at preparing the Soviet Union for an anticipated full-scale war against significant portions of the capitalist world. The fragile peace established after World War I and the Russian Civil War was rapidly unraveling, and the threat of international military intervention into the USSR seemed increasingly imminent. However, this was no longer the Soviet Union of the 1920s or even the 1930s. By 1940, the share of the government budget allocated to military spending had skyrocketed from 17% in 1937 to 33%, reflecting the urgency of the situation. Yet the critical question remained: would they be ready in time? Following a pattern seen among 20th century world powers before and after World War II, the Soviet Union asserted its influence over the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. This move was another facet in the secret protocols outlined in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. However, the tenuous nature of the Soviet-Nazi alliance was further highlighted when the USSR signed mutual assistance treaties with these Baltic states later that year. These agreements were designed to create a defensive buffer against a potential invasion by Nazi Germany, the very co-signers of the pact. These treaties, undoubtedly enforced by the significant power imbalance, allowed the Soviets to establish key naval bases in the region, stationing tens of thousands of troops. The strategic placement of troops in ice-free Baltic ports provided a major military advantage, while the region's abundant resources and developed heavy industry offered additional economic and logistical benefits. Stalin made the interventions behind this new alliance unmistakably clear during discussions with Latvian officials in 1939. He said, "The Germans might attack. For 6 years, German fascists and communists cursed each other. Now, despite history, there has been an unexpected turn, but one cannot rely upon it. We must be prepared in time. Others, who were not prepared, paid for it." However, the impetus behind the gradual Sovietization of the Baltics extended beyond mere military strategy. In Stalin's view, it also represented an opportunity to complete the revolutions that had been crushed decades earlier by British and German interventionists who had allied with White Russian forces during the Russian Civil War. At various points, strong labor and socialist movements in the Baltics had successfully established communes, and even a short-lived Latvian Soviet Republic in 1919. Like the recently returned territories of eastern Poland, the Baltic states were seen by Stalin and his late mentor Lenin as integral parts of the socialist homeland that needed to be reclaimed. It was only out of necessity, at the end of the Civil War, that the Bolshevik government under Lenin signed peace treaties with the newly independent liberal democracies of the Baltics in the early 1920s. These agreements were made reluctantly, as the priority at the time was to secure the survival of the revolution in Russia. But that was 2 decades ago. By 1940, the Soviets had gained the upper hand. Although the semi-fascist regimes in the Baltics were reluctant to lose their independence to any powerful neighbor, they would have preferred German intervention over Soviet influence. The reason for this preference was clear. Sovietization would smash their national bourgeoisie and upend the existing social order. When signing the mutual assistance treaties, Stalin assured the Baltic states that the USSR had little desire to interfere with their internal affairs. The promise was upheld, until the Soviets claimed that the treaties had been significantly violated. In June 1940, the Soviets accused members of the Baltic governments of engaging in anti-Soviet activities that undermined the treaties. They alleged a military conspiracy involving all 3 states. At least one diplomat interrogated by the NKVD admitted to the existence of a secret military alliance. While the evidence remains disputed, it is worth noting that the Baltics had long been used as a launchpad for both German and Japanese anti-communist subversion. To avoid large-scale conflict and amid massive street protests by workers throughout June, the Baltic states were incorporated into the USSR through a series of elections. Following these elections, rapid Sovietization ensued. Banks were nationalized, land was collectivized, and property belonging to the church and private enterprises was seized. Today, historical focus on this period often centers on the admittedly harsh mass deportations of the bourgeoisie to the Soviet interior. The Soviet political actions in Poland and the Baltics demonstrated that, despite Trotskyist propaganda to the contrary, the USSR had not abandoned the idea of spreading revolution across Europe. A 1930 planning memo of Soviet government stated the following: the adequate development of the revolutionary movement in capitalist society, a sufficiently strong economic and political base, and purely military preparation might place before us the question of a move toward a military offensive against capitalism in order to further world revolution. Socialism in one country never precluded the spread of revolution, but rather predicated a future successful global revolution on the building first of a thriving socialist state. Before delving into the Great Patriotic War, let us turn our attention to a quiet villa on the outskirts of Mexico City. It is August 20th, 1940, and the residence belongs to Lev Davidovich Bronstein, better known to the world as Leon Trotsky. Ramon Mercader, a Spanish communist, a veteran of the Civil War, and self-proclaimed Trotskyist, had secured an appointment with Trotsky himself. The two secluded themselves in Trotsky's study to discuss a document Mercader had brought. What happened next was swift and brutal. Mercader later testified at his trial. I laid my raincoat on the table in such a way as to be able to remove the ice axe hidden in the pocket. I decided not to miss the opportunity that presented itself. The moment Trotsky began reading the article, he gave me my chance. I took out the ice axe, gripped it firmly, and with my eyes closed, dealt him a terrible blow to the head. Despite the devastating blow, Trotsky fought back furiously. breaking his assailant's hand in the struggle. The commotion alerted Trotsky's bodyguards, who burst into the room, subdued Mercader, and savagely beat him. His life was spared, so he could be interrogated later. Trotsky, gravely injured, was rushed to the hospital and underwent surgery. He succumbed to his injuries the following day, August 21st, 1940. According to James Cannon, the Trotskyist secretary of the American Socialist Workers' Party, Trotsky's final words were theatrically on brand. "I will not survive this attack. Stalin has finally accomplished the task he attempted unsuccessfully before." Trotsky's death made front-page news around the world. In stark contrast, Pravda, the official newspaper of the Communist Party of the USSR, gave it only a brief mention, stating, "Trotsky, having sunk to the depths of human depravity, became entangled in his own web and was killed by one of his disciples. Thus, a hated man met his inglorious end, descending to his grave branded as a murderer and international spy." While the Soviet narrative claimed that Mercader was merely a disgruntled follower of Trotsky, it later became clear that he was, in fact, an NKVD operative who had deeply infiltrated Trotsky's inner circle. Mercader served 20 years in the Mexican prison system before being released in 1960. After his release, he spent time in socialist Cuba before moving to the USSR, where he was awarded the Order of Lenin, the highest civilian honor in the Soviet Union, and the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for his role in Trotsky's assassination. In our research, we were unable to recover any record of Stalin's personal reaction to Trotsky's death. This minute but tantalizing gap in history we leave to the imagination of our listeners.
Truth and fiction about the Soviet response to Operation Barbarossa. After having conquered and absorbing the manpower, industrial might, and land of Austria, Czechoslovakia, most of Scandinavia, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, among other nations, the Nazi war machine set its sights finally on its most desired target, the USSR. On June 22, 1941, the Nazi plan entitled Operation Barbarossa launched the largest land invasion in history. The name of the operation comes from the title of the medieval ruler Frederick I, whose official title was that of Holy Roman Emperor. He was viewed historically as being a great expander of German territory, influence, and power. Many myths today persist about Stalin and the Soviet response to the Nazi invasion, largely fueled by Nikita Khrushchev's so-called secret speech delivered 3 years after Stalin's death. While this speech, meant to take his predecessor down more than a few notches, was initially taken as gospel, it has since been met with skepticism, as Soviet archives and primary source documents have debunked many of its claims. Nevertheless, the speech significantly tarnished Stalin's legacy, even within communist circles, an impact which is still felt to this day. For this section, we're going to be addressing some of these most persistent myths, drawing on thorough refutations found in works such as Domenico Lacerdo's Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. Myth number 1, Stalin ignored reports of an imminent Nazi invasion, leaving the Soviet Union totally surprised. We've already established that Stalin did not trust the Nazis and had been preparing for an eventual invasion by them for years. Soviet preparation efforts included rapid industrialization, collectivization, purges to root out potential fifth columnists, military expansion, and the acquiring of territories such as the Baltics and eastern Poland. All of these actions were aimed at strengthening Soviet defenses. This myth hinges on the fact that Stalin did receive numerous reports from credible sources warning of a Nazi invasion, yet he was unable to rightfully determine the exact date of this invasion in advance. However, it's important to note that in the fog of war, misinformation is a common tactic employed by all sides. Stalin and the Soviet leadership were no strangers to this, having experienced it during the Russian Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, and conflicts in the Far East, as well as becoming quite skilled at disinformation themselves. For example, just a month before the invasion, the Nazis had deployed 14 army divisions in a way that suggested an attack on Western Europe or even a land invasion of the UK was imminent. On June 14, 1941, the Berlin edition of the Volkscher Beobachter published an article comparing an alleged planned invasion of the UK to the Nazi occupation of Crete. The newspaper was quickly seized to create the illusion that a critical secret had been leaked. 3 days later, Joseph Goebbels noted in his diary that British radio was dismissing the legitimate Nazi buildup on Soviet borders as a bluff to mask preparation for an invasion of England. Soviet intelligence identified over 100 potential invasion dates between 1940 and 1941. Historian Arsen Martirosyan argues that Stalin hesitated to act because of the lack of reliable evidence and legitimate concerns about deliberate misinformation from German, British, and French intelligence. Rumors had circulated that the Nazi military buildup in the East was intended to pressure the USSR into renegotiating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, securing greater exports of grain, oil, and coal to fuel the Nazi effort. The goal of this apparent bluff was to convince Stalin that the crisis could be resolved through diplomacy rather than war. Stalin was acutely aware of the risks of being labeled a provocateur and dragged into a conflict by Western powers, a scenario, in fact, that had contributed to Russia's involvement in World War I. Given the stakes, miscalculating the situation could have been catastrophic. Stalin's cautious approach was a calculated gamble. Delaying war until 1942 would allow the USSR to strengthen its defenses and complete its preparations. Paradoxically, while the German attack on June 22, 1941 was not a surprise in terms of its eventuality, the scale and ferocity of the assault, a full-scale strategic offensive from the outset, caught the Soviets off guard. The Nazi forces' rapid armored advances shattered the Red Army's defenses and penetrated deep into Soviet territory. Despite the exact timing and date of the surprise attack, which is still today the largest land invasion in human history, the Red Army was aware something was brewing and had taken steps accordingly regarding the implementation of several defensive measures. For example, from May to June 1941, 800,000 reservists were called up. In mid-May 1941, 28 divisions were deployed to the western military districts. On May 27th, these districts were ordered to construct field command posts. In June, about 40,000 men were sent to fortify border areas. From June 12th to the 15th, just a week before the actual invasion, forces were ordered to move closer to the frontier. On June 19th, district headquarters were instructed to relocate to new command posts, and orders were issued to camouflage targets and disperse aircraft. By June 1941, the Red Army had over 300 divisions, totaling approximately 5.5 million personnel, with about half of those stationed in the western border districts. On the night of June 21st to the 22nd, this vast force was placed on high alert, warned to expect a surprise German attack. While there are many valid criticisms of Stalin, his lack of omniscience is not one of them. Historians like Jeffrey Roberts has argued that Stalin's misjudgment was rooted in a rational assessment of the geopolitical situation. His cautious approach, though flawed and imperfect, as can be expected from any person in this situation, was an attempt to navigate an incredibly complex and dangerous international landscape. Myth number 2. After hearing of the invasion, Stalin froze, went AWOL, and became totally useless as a leader in those early weeks of the invasion. As a previous myth, this one finds its origins in Khrushchev's secret speech of 1956, where he claimed that Stalin had disappeared for several days soon after the Nazi invasion, suffering a nervous breakdown, leaving the Soviet Union leaderless in the face of total catastrophe. However, this narrative has been largely discredited in modern historiography. Entries from Stalin's Kremlin appointment book, as well as memoirs from figures like Marshal Zhukov, reveal that Stalin was actively engaged in the early days of the war effort. The discovery of Stalin's visitor logs in the early 1990s, when the Soviet archives opened up, further debunked Khrushchev's claims. These records show that Stalin held a series of intense meetings and initiatives to organize the Soviet resistance immediately after the invasion. His schedule during this period was marked by strenuous activity conducted in an orderly and deliberate manner. Historian Jeffrey Roberts notes that, however shaken he was, Stalin had 11 hours of meetings with party, state, and military leaders on the day of the attack, and he received visitors almost continuously for the next several days. This evidence, and more, led historian Domenico Lacerdo to the following conclusion. The whole episode, narrated by Khrushchev, is a complete fabrication. This story is false. That said, there is evidence that Stalin experienced a brief period of listlessness and depression around June 28th to the 30th, 1941. This was, to say the least, uncharacteristic of the typically decisive, in-control leader. A high-level delegation, including Molotov, approached Stalin to propose the formation of a state defense committee to centralize military and economic efforts for the war. Molotov had warned the delegation that Stalin was, and I quote, in such a state of prostration that he wasn't interested in anything, had lost all initiative and was in a bad way. When the delegation arrived at Stalin's dacha, he was visibly surprised and asked, "What have you come for?" Molotov explained the plan and proposed that Stalin head the committee. Stalin's response was simply, "Fine." It seems likely that Stalin initially feared the delegation had perhaps come to replace or even arrest him, a fate admittedly he himself might have imposed on others in similar circumstances. Remarkably, the delegation had briefly considered replacing Stalin with Molotov if he could not pull himself out of this pit. It's fair to say that in this moment, Stalin's leadership was hanging by a thread. And what this very revealing human moment of Stalin reveals was that rather than be rejected by his men, rather than being arrested, rather than being removed, his men came to him and asked for his leadership, which demonstrated the total faith they had in him as a leader to guide them through the apocalypse. And the apocalypse was what they were facing. During the chaos of those early days, Stalin is quoted as saying, "Lenin left us a great inheritance, and we, his heirs, have fucked it all up." This rather candid admission underscores the immense pressure Stalin faced during the early days of the war. While he may have briefly faltered under the weight of the crisis, the notion that he completely withdrew or became totally incapacitated for weeks and days on end, Stalin's actions in the days following the invasion demonstrate that he remained actively involved in organizing the Soviet response, even as he grappled internally with the enormity of the situation. Myth number 3. The Soviet Union was unprepared for Operation Barbarossa due to a total lack of planning in advance of the attack. This myth suggests that the USSR's early struggles against the Nazi invasion were the result of incompetence or just general lack of foresight. However, evidence reveals a much more nuanced picture. While the Soviet Union faced significant challenges, it also demonstrated remarkable resilience and strategic planning in response to the invasion, as we've already covered. This is despite Western powers initially underestimating the Soviet Union's capacity to resist. British intelligence at the time predicted that the USSR would be liquidated in 8 to 10 weeks, while advisor to US Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson estimated the conflict would last between 1 and 3 months. Today, very little is said about these incompetent perceptions of Soviet readiness, while myths flourish freely about their alleged unpreparedness. One of the most striking examples of Soviet readiness in advance of Operation Barbarossa was a massive evacuation of industry to the east, which was organized by the Committee of Evacuation. Despite being formed 2 days after the invasion, the work of the committee was actually part of a process that had begun weeks and even months leading up to the invasion. According to recent scholarship, around 2,600 enterprises were relocated along with estimated 25 million workers and their families. Many of these factories were moved to undeveloped sites where workers endured harsh conditions, such as 8,000 women working at a tank factory living in holes dug in the ground. Despite these difficulties, by 1942 the majority of these factories were operational, producing substantial quantities of armaments and other important war resources. Additionally, to guard the rear of this historic evacuation process and to maintain resistance in occupied territory, the USSR quickly mobilized civilian militias to support the war effort. These militias played a vital role in slowing the German advance, buying time for the Red Army to regroup and counterattack. The sheer scale of the Eastern Front, people forget, spanned 1,800 miles with few natural obstacles, which provided the German forces with significant advantages in maneuverability through the territory and general infiltration of it. Despite the Red Army's size, the low ratio of force to space allowed the Nazi military to exploit gaps and advance rapidly. However, on the flip side, this also meant that the Soviet Union's vast territory ultimately worked in its favor, as the Germans ended up overextending their supply lines and faced logistical nightmares as a result. Even Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels acknowledged the unexpected strength of the Soviet Union. In his diary entry from August 19, 1941, he wrote, "Privately, the Führer is very irritated with himself for having been so deceived so much about the potential of the Bolsheviks by reports from German agents in the Soviet Union. In particular, his underestimation of the enemy's armored infantry and air forces created many problems. He has suffered a lot. This is a serious crisis. The campaigns we had carried out until now were almost locks. The Führer has no reason to be concerned about the West. In our German rigor and objectivity, we have always overestimated our enemies." And finally, the Soviet Union's ability to conceal its military capabilities from German intelligence was another factor in Soviet readiness. Back to Joseph Goebbels in his diary, writing, For our confidence in our spies, it was almost impossible to penetrate inside the Soviet Union. They could not acquire precise vision. The Bolsheviks worked directly to deceive us. Of a number of weapons they possessed, especially heavy weapons, we were unable to learn anything clearly. Exactly the opposite occurred in France, where we knew practically everything and could not have been surprised at all. While the Soviet Union faced significant challenges in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, the narrative of total unpreparedness is a myth. The USSR's ability to evacuate and reconvert its industry, mobilize its population, and deceive German intelligence demonstrates a level of strategic planning and resilience that ultimately contributed to its victory in the Great Patriotic War. By the end of 1942, the Soviet Union, as a result of Barbarossa, endured massive losses in both military and civilian populations. So in the year and a half following the start of the invasion in June 1941, approximately 3 million Soviet soldiers were killed, about 4 million wounded. Between 3 and 3.5 million Soviet soldiers have been captured by the Germans during this period. While these military casualties are in fact very high, civilian deaths were even higher. By the end of 1942, it's approximated that 7 million citizens died as a result of the invasion, whether due to massacre, starvation, or disease. That brings the total number of casualties as a result of the Nazi invasion by the end of 1942 to 12 million dead Soviet citizens. Was this to be the end of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics? So that about does it for this episode of the Stalin Eras. I want to thank all of our listeners and Patreon subscribers. The newest ones are Hans A, Kenneth G, Noah Shu, Amelia E, Elmoy, B. Keith B, Lefty in Training, Jesse, Lauren D, Bori, Zeno, Marlon L, Prolet Aaron, Rosanna F, Jason Van B, Trom 210, Anton P, AJ, Annette C, Another Filthy Peasant, Stephen P, Todd P, Corey, Death Trumba, Jose R, J Love, Gonzalo B, Comrade Benjamin, Okim A, Will Ja Helmaz, Joshua XVX, Joseph Smith Was a Predator, Oliver Heimvik M, Zachary McD, Oh My Berries, Millie Esther, Casey Ing, Hans Skoo, Falco, ML Sparky, and Ian Snyder. And special shout out to our Vanguard subscribers, Better Red Than Liberal, Paul Luders, Talking Socks, Alex, and The Wicking Cossack. If you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/Prolespod for free. If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at prolespod@outlook.com. Please also follow, review, like, and all that fun algorithm stuff, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. May the Spectre haunt your street, and solidarity forever.